Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. I'm Papa Boris here, back with another chess game, and I'd like to show you a game by Alekhine, one of my favorite chess players of all time, and when I was a little boy, he actually was my very favorite chess player. He was the 4th world chess champion. He was known for very chaotic play in the sense that he would try to go for really complicated positions, and in that sense, he was a nice counterpart to the 3rd world champion, Capablanca, who was known for very straightforward positions and simple strategic play. So when Alekhine beat him with his complicated stuff, it was a victory for attacking complicated combinatorial style chess players everywhere. In this game, however, Alekhine was not yet the world chess champion. This was played in 1918, and it was played in a blind simultaneous exhibition. Now, I wasn't able to find information about this particular exhibition, so I don't know exactly how many people Alexander Alekhine played at the same time while blindfolded, but it seems to have been at least 6, according to chessgames.com, so we'll take it. His opponent was some guy named Gonsoriovsky. I don't know who that is, and he was white. He opened things up with e4. Alekhine played e5, and after bishop c4, known as the bishop's opening, Alekhine replied with knight to f6, which is called the Berlin defense. There's also a Berlin defense in the Roy Lopez, where white's bishop is on b5, and black also makes this early knight to f6 move. Now white decides to play d3 to protect that pawn on e4, after which black plays c6, going for a break in the center with d5. Now here on move 4, white already makes a mistake. He plays queen to e2. This was not a professional chess player, it was a guy playing at a simul, so, you know, mistakes are bound to be made, and plus the 1918s were an innocent time where people just did stupid things on move 4 in the opening. So why is queen to e2 such a bad move? Well, first of all, it moves the queen. And a good rule of thumb is you shouldn't develop the queen early on unless you have a very good reason. There's really no good reason to put the queen to e2. My guess, given how this game went, is that Gonsoriovsky was an aggressive player and he wanted to castle queenside. And certainly, castling queenside when your opponent castles kingside does open up things for a more dynamic, more attacking game. That being said, you shouldn't put your queen on e2 as the second move of the game. There are still minor pieces that need to be developed, and the queen here doesn't really do anything besides protect e4, which is already protected. And to the extent that e4 needs more protection, it would make a lot more sense to protect it with a move like knight to c3, or even knight to d2 in some cases, and protect the pawn that way, while also developing a minor piece. So, how does Alekhine respond? Well, he just calmly goes on about developing, and notice that with this move, black has 2 minor pieces developed, whereas white only has 1. Black is ready to castle on the next move, whereas white still cannot castle. And he's actually at least 3 moves away from castling if he is going to go for it queenside. So black gets a lead in development pretty much for free. Here, white compounds his troubles and begins a fast, slippery slope towards doom with his next move, f4. Again, this is a very aggressive move, to be sure, but it's got some issues. So first of all, white is moving a pawn here instead of moving a piece, so he's not continuing his development. Second of all, while f4 does have some merits in general, opening up this f-file for the white rook, for example, white's not planning to castle kingside necessarily, so it doesn't make sense to go for this early on if you're going to castle queenside and you still have pieces that need to move before you can castle queenside. On top of that, you know, leaving a pawn off of f2 can be a little bit weakening. If black gets a queen or a bishop on this diagonal, that can make it difficult for white to castle kingside if he does change his mind and want to go that way. And plus, that diagonal is just very weak for white in general. It's going to be difficult to block it using any resources at this point. Now, Alekhine finds a very nice way of dealing with the situation. Taking the pawn wouldn't have been bad, but he actually plunges ahead with d5. And now white's definitely in a worse spot. White has to proceed very carefully. If white takes this pawn on e5, then black can actually black actually has several different things here he could do. He could even do something crazy like knight takes e4, this works. But even if black just simply takes the bishop, and then white takes the knight, and then black takes the pawn, notice now that black has all the advantages. He's got 1 piece developed, and if you discount white's queen, white has no pieces developed. Black is ready to castle, white is not. This bishop on this diagonal is also a big problem because now if white's bishop moves, then black actually takes on b2 and wins a rook. So this bishop can't move. White has to make some move like c3 in order to be able to develop his pieces. And if you do play something like knight to c3, you know, then it's a game. Black can, for example, take here, And after recapturing, you know, you can just get the ball rolling with his development. And there's really no good factor here for white. He's just behind in development and has achieved nothing. Now, I doubt that his Alekhine's opponent calculated any of this, but this is just to show that white needs to be a little bit careful how he continues the game. So at this point, Alekhine's opponent decided to play e takes d5. And then Alekhine here took the pawn on f4. And what's interesting now is that, yes, white does get to develop his bishop while recapturing on f4, but black now simply castles. And what's interesting is if you go back to this position a few moves ago, this is move 7 that just happened, if you go back to white's 4th move just 3 moves ago, when the queen moved to e2, it's hard to imagine with these pawns here that the queen on e2 could be any kind of a problem for white. And yet, Alekhine was very clever because he managed to get capture away from the center here and induced white to capture away from the center there. So these pawns exited the building, and now after black simply castles, there's a threat that the rook will go here and pin the white queen to the king. That's not necessarily going to win the queen. There are ways that it could be blocked. You could, for example, interpose with this bishop, but it would certainly be an uncomfortable situation for white. And white can't just like hurry up and castle. For example, if white tries something like knight to f3, this gets really bad really fast. Black takes the pawn here, the bishop moves, let's say, and then after a6 and bishop to a4, the queen comes to a5 with check, and it's also forking the bishop. So white would then have to go knight to c3 to protect this bishop, but now black plays bishop to b4, threatening a capture here, and after the pawn recaptures, take this bishop on a4. And if the bishop moves, then black just plunges in with d4, pinning the knight. And taking this pawn doesn't really help black at all because now, or shall help white at all because now after takes, and check, the king moves, and black picks up this knight. So, yeah, white has to be very careful how he proceeds because if he just tries to race ahead and castle, like with knight to f3, you know, it can be a problem. I also want to show one more variation. If white tries to sidestep this by going to b3, for example, then, yeah, black can just go rook to e8. And then if you castle, well, you're in trouble because after bishop to c5 check, you're losing a queen. The bishop's attacking the king and the rook's attacking the queen. So, I don't know how much of this Alekhine's opponent actually calculated, but he decided to hurry up and try to castle queenside with knight to d2. And now, after black takes the pawn and the bishop goes back to b3, Alekhine really could proceed in a bunch of different ways here. He could just play rook to e8. It's a totally fine move. But he decided to say, hey, you're going to castle queenside because you want to attack me? All right, buddy, I'm going to attack you. And he pushed a5. Alekhine had a thing for pushing pawns. He loved to push pawns. He loved to get past pawns. And now this move comes with a threat. Alekhine's threatening to go a4 and trap this bishop on b3. So the best way to get out of this, although white is already losing, is to play bishop to a4 and blockade the pawn. But Alekhine's opponent decided to play c3, giving the bishop a place to run. After a4, the bishop hops back to c2, and now Alekhine pushes the pawn in all the way. So now this pawn is a dagger in white's heart. White can't really take this pawn because after black does something very simple, like just taking it, you know, white can't castle. And with the bishop blocking c1, it's unclear what white is going to do to get an advantage in this position. So the opponent here, white, Mr. Gonsoriovsky, decided to just push b3, which is probably making things worse. It might have been better just to ignore that pawn, develop this knight to f3, and try to castle kingside if possible. But with this, Alekhine can just play rook to e8, and now there's this discovery available on the queen. If black's bishop moves, then the queen is under attack. Now, a good rule of thumb, whenever your opponent has the potential for a discovery on your king, or on your queen, or sometimes even on one of your minor pieces, you should consider every single potential discovery carefully. Really think through one by one, what is every place that this bishop could move, leading to a discovered attack on my queen, and make sure it's all okay. Because if you don't do that, if you castle queenside like this guy did, then you might face a move like, bam, bishop to b4. So it seems to be hanging the bishop, but of course it's not, because if you take the bishop, then you lose your queen. So now, white responded with queen to f2. There were potentially better moves. The engine actually recommends taking the bishop and letting your queen get lost. But after the queen goes to f2, Black wins a pawn on c3, and not just any pawn, but it's a pretty darn good pawn. It's one of the pawns that's needed for the defense of the king, and there's this pawn on a3 that's helping the bishop get in here and put the white king in a very uncomfortable position. Now here, white has already lost, so I'm not going to commentate too much on some of these next moves, because even if, white could have made better moves, and black could have made better moves, at this point it's just a matter of white, how do you want to lose, and for Alekhine, how do you want to win this game? So white decided to play bishop to g5. This pins the knight to the queen, but it's a pretty toothless move, as we'll see. Alekhine played knight to c6, a very calm developing move, and I will come back to this move later. There's a significance to this move that we will see towards the end of the game. Here, white proceeded with knight to f3, and black played d4, strengthening this bishop on c3, and also paving the way for a little bit of a tactic, which, not surprisingly, his opponent totally missed. White calmly and blithely played rook h to e1, trying to control the e-file. Now follows bishop to b2 check, and after the king moves, the point of this move d4 is revealed. Alekhine plays knight to d5. So his queen is hanging for the first time this game, but of course it can't be taken because then knight to c3 is checkmate. And in fact, it's kind of difficult to find a way for white to even stop this checkmate. The king is hemmed in by this pawn which can't move, this bishop which can't be captured, and can't go to a1 or c1. So the king's only possible escape square is c2, but hilariously this bishop here is literally worse than a pawn. A pawn could move forward, but this bishop is hemmed in on all four corners, so it's stuck. The only way that white can prolong the game here is to first capture on e8 with check, and after the rook is recaptured, play knight to e4, which protects the square. But of course, it's not real protection, because now Alekhine hangs his queen for the second time this game and just captures that knight. Obviously, the queen can't be taken, because if it is, then knight to c3 is again checkmate. So how do you stop this? Well, there isn't any way. If you're white, you're losing this game. But white tried bishop to d2, just protecting that c3 square. And now this is a very instructive moment. One of the most fundamental ideas in tactical chess is deflection. If one of your opponent's pieces is protecting a square and you don't want him to protect the square, then see if you can deflect that piece by attacking it from an unusual angle. Here, Alekhine hangs his queen for the third time in this game, so I think this is now going to be 3 moves that Alekhine's queen is en prise, as they say, and he plays queen to e3. Normally, this would be a very startling move, but if you've got the fundamentals of chess down, it makes perfect sense. The bishop can't take the queen, because if it does, then knight to c3 is checkmate. And if you just ignore this and try to carry on with your life, if you, I don't know, play something like queen g3 or whatever, then black can just gobble up this bishop and checkmate. So what do you do as white to try to make progress? Well, nothing, you're losing. But white played rook to e1, and now comes bishop to f5, leaving the black queen hanging for a 4th time this game. So what exactly is the deal here? Well, if you take the queen with your queen, then after d takes e3, black is threatening this bishop, and then this knight to c3 is still a specter that is giving mate to white. So white has no choice here but to give up his rook. And now black can just give up the knight for the rook, and when the smoke is cleared, black is up a whole rook, and he's going to win the game. So trading queens honestly doesn't work. Taking the queen with the bishop doesn't work because, again, knight to c3 is checkmate. So what do you do? What happens if you take the queen with the rook? Well, that's what white did. So after 4 moves en prise, black's queen finally gets taken by the rook, and now the plan is revealed. Black simply recaptures the rook with the pawn. And this shows the importance of the bishop to f5 move. Alekhine really thrived in deep, complicated positions and loved all kinds of tactics. And so here, the point of bishop f5 is that now, if white tries to wriggle out of this situation with bishop to d1, black can actually play bishop takes d3, and this will lead to a forced checkmate in, well, according to the engine, 7 moves. But the important thing is that even if you don't care about checkmates, here, eventually black's just grabbing this queen and is up so much material that it doesn't really matter when checkmate is coming. So that's the importance of this bishop to f5 move. It's putting check to that pawn if this bishop ever tries to leave. Okay, so now white tried, at this point, queen to f1, and at this point white just actually voluntarily resigned, because there's just nothing that white can do. After black takes the bishop, then knight to c3 is threatened. And if the bishop runs to try to give the white king a place to escape, now we finally get to the point of knight to c6. The reason it's nice to have this knight here is the knight can actually come to b4 and cut off c2 even if the white bishop vacates that square. And now there's nothing that nothing white can do to stop black from going knight to c3 with checkmate. Note that if white had tried some other place of moving the queen, like queen to h4, with the idea that after e takes d2, white can play queen to c4 and protect against the checkmate, this is still a forced checkmate, and even without the forced checkmate, I mean, black is just a piece and a rook here, so it's going to be game over no matter what. So in any case, after queen to f1, white resigned, and Alekhine got a victory in an impressive blind simultaneous display. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe if you did, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody.